Today is Monday, February 7th. It's my pleasure to be with Andy Silverman, a 1969 graduate of the University of Arizona College of Law. I am Vicki Fleischer, here to ask you a couple questions, Professor Silverman. Can you tell us, first of all, let's go back to the beginning. Why did you decide to go to law school?
Well, it's very interesting. It wasn't a lifelong desire. I was a journalist. I was a police reporter specifically for the Arizona Republic. And one day I was just talking to somebody, and he said, "Gosh, do you know you could go to law school by just taking this test, and if you do fairly well in this test, you can go to law school. There's not any particular background that one needs to go to law school." And so I thought about it for a little while, and I said, wow, maybe I'll try that. So I did so, and actually when I applied to law school and even came to law school, and really even till my maybe third year in law school, I was always interested in going back to being a journalist. And I thought by having a law background that would help me as far as being a journalist, but it wasn't really even a desire to be a lawyer. And in my third year, my feelings about law changed substantially.
Mm-hmm. Why did you choose the University of Arizona to go to law school?
Well, first of all, at the time it was the only law school in Arizona, and I was working in Phoenix, and as I said, I decided very late to go to law school. There wasn't a lot of thought put behind it, and it was, it just sort of made sense to come here.
Mm-hmm. How many students were in your entering class, do you remember?
A lot. I think around 240.
Wow. And how many were in the graduating class?
About half that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, in those days, it was the days that when you came to law school, the only orientation you had was look to your left and look to your right, and two of you won't be here upon graduation.
Huh. Times have changed, thankfully, for our students.
Right. Thank you. Yes.
What were your classmates like?
Well, this was in the middle 60s, so it was clearly a lot of people coming to law school and to do something significant, that is to make some social changes. But then there were just a lot of people coming to law school, I think, for the same reason that people always came to law school. They saw it as a good profession to be in. It was primarily white males. There were very few women in my class. I think just a couple, and there were very few people of color. So it was a very homogeneous group in that way.
Mm-hmm. Were most of your classmates also from Arizona?
Well, most were from Arizona, but there were others. There were people from other places as well, but the high percentage, again, ASU Law School was just starting then, so there was clearly a very high percentage of Arizonans.
Mm-hmm. Were you involved with any extracurricular activities at the law school?
Yeah, I was involved in some. There weren't a lot of organizations. Again, it was sort of a different time.
Mm-hmm.
Charles Ayers, when I came to law school, he just became dean. His first year as dean was my first year in law school.
Uh-huh.
Actually, he was one of my first year professors. And there wasn't really a lot organizationally going on within the law school. Again, because it was during the Vietnam War, I was involved in a lot of the anti-war activities that were occurring on campus. But within the law school, there wasn't a lot. It was just starting to happen that there were activities occurring and so on. To be very honest, at that time, the law school wasn't real student-oriented.
Mm-hmm. Were there journals and law reviews at that time?
There was the law review.
Uh-huh.
I wasn't on the law review, even though in my third year I wrote a law review article with David Wexler, who was, of course, a professor who came here my second year. We co-authored an article that was in the Arizona Law Review. But that was the only publication at the time. There was the law review and there was moot court.
Mm-hmm.
Those were probably the two biggest activities here.
Mm-hmm. What did students do during the summer between law school years?
They worked. I remember I went to we had summer school then.
Mm-hmm.
Probably a fairly big summer school. I did that. There weren't a lot of law jobs. There wasn't a placement service at that time, so people basically fend for themselves. I think maybe possibly one of the secretaries of law school kind of helped with that, or administrators, I can't remember, but there wasn't a lot of placement assistance. And so people just looked for themselves. Most of the jobs I had in law school were actually non-legal related jobs.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the clinical programs.
Okay.
What were they like in 1969?
Didn't have any.
Didn't have
Well,
any.
actually, no, we didn't have any. The first clinical program started here at this law school was one that I was involved in starting. I was a research assistant for David Wexler. He came here during my second year. During my third year, he and I assisted him. We began a program representing inmates at the state prison called the Post-Conviction Legal Assistance Clinic, which was the very first clinic here. So really not until my third year, and maybe, it was either my first or second semester, I can't even remember now. I think it may have been my second semester, my third year is actually when it got started.
Mm-hmm.
So there were, at least while I was in law school, very few students who even participated, because that was the only clinic. It wasn't started until I was a third-year law student. And that's kind of what brought me back to the law school after I graduated.
Mm-hmm. The clinical one.
That particular clinic.
Oh, okay.
There was, after I was out of law school, the law school got a grant to hire 2 clinicians. One to run the post-conviction clinic, and the law school hired me to do so. And the other was more of a general clinical program, and they hired Kenny Hageland under that position. So Kenny and I came, I came back to law school, and Kenny came to law school in 1970.
Great. It's really interesting to hear the history of it. When you were in law school, where did most of your fellow classmates live?
Live?
Mm-hmm.
Most of them, well, there seemed to be more student housing. The ones who were married would live in married student housing. At that time, there was a thing called the Polo Village, which was near the law school, which was sort of Quonset hut kind of area that was created after World War II, so there were law students living in there. Apartments, of course, around the school. I guess kind of the same kind of living arrangements most law school students have today.
Mm-hmm. So when you graduated, you came back to law school to teach as a clinician?
Well, I left for a year, actually.
Mm-hmm.
When I graduated, I kind of had 2 interests. One was kind of because of the work I did with David Wexler in the criminal law, particularly doing criminal defense work, appellate work, but I was unable at that time to get a job in that field. The public defender's offices were not hiring and so on. Kind of another interest I had was just, I guess, kind of an interest that came out of the 60s and looking at what big organizations and corporations were doing, and it kind of steered me to doing, at least I thought I had an interest in, antitrust work. And so I went to work for Maricopa County in Phoenix. At the time had 2 large antitrust suits pending. one dealing with plumbing fixtures, one dealing with asphalt. And I was hired to work on those cases again with some other attorneys, some other attorneys who were working on that. And so I did that for a while.
What did some of your classmates do after they graduated? What was the job market like?
Weren't a lot of government jobs as there are now. I mean, some did go into government, both on the criminal and civil side. Most of them went into private practice, either out on their own. Some actually went out on their own to big firms, small firms. There wasn't really any public interest work at that time, other than legal services, and some went into that.
But you all took the bar exam.
We all took the bar exam.
What was it like?
Actually, I like the experience. To me, I mean, which is probably different than most people. To me, it kind of brought everything in my legal education together at one time, and I didn't really mind, studying it or studying for it. And it was, I think, easy. It probably wasn't quite as stressful as it is today. There wasn't the multi-state as there is now. It was the Arizona bar was 2.5 days, all essay. And I remember when I did it, it was kind of grueling to do it, but the actual preparation I didn't mind, and so I didn't look at it as a horrible experience.
Was there any faculty interaction with the students outside the classroom when you were in law school?
Well, not a lot. I mean, again, Charles Ayers was just coming in as dean, and he I think it was starting to happen during his deanship. During his second year as dean, he brought in a number of younger faculty, people like David Wexler, Bill Boyd, Witten Woods, and others. And so there was starting to be, I remember while I was in law school, there was at least 1 or 2 parties and so on that there were some faculty there with law students. I became, fairly friendly with David Wexler through my work with him, but there wasn't a lot of interaction.
I have a couple questions about your classes in law school. How many students were in the average lecture?
First of all, there was no seminars as far as I can remember. I remember there was maybe 1 or 2 seminars kind of in the tax corporate area. And I think in my 3rd year there, he was starting to have some seminars, so I did participate then. So those were smaller classes, but generally they were, each class had a couple hundred students, so they were usually large classes, 30, 50 and up. So they were all, fairly large.
And what building were you in when you were in law school?
Was in probably what was the second law school, near the Park Student Center. It's now called the Franklin Building. Which at that time it was not real old. It was, it had been there for a number of years by that time. And it was interesting, you can tell where legal education was. There were no seminar rooms in the building. They had to convert some other rooms in order, once we started developing seminars. There was a courtroom. There were classrooms, they were all large. The library was in the basement, so there were no windows or anything. It was always crowded. There was, I know at least on the upper floors, not on the main floor, there was a men's and women's bathroom, but on the upper floors there was just a bathroom, since I don't think there were many women probably above the main floor of that building. That is, women on the faculty, there were of course some women on staff and so on. It was just legal education was different when that building was constructed.
What were some of the electives that were offered at the time?
First of all, there were a lot of required courses. Most, I think all the way through the 3 years you were in law school, you had primarily, or at least a lot of required courses. So the electives, and again, I think more of them started as, maybe even when I was in my third year. There were some tax courses, I think, that were elective. There were some courses maybe in the corporate area. There was there were some criminal-related courses. I mean, again, because there was a smaller faculty that was teaching more students and most everything was required, they really did not have the ability to offer that many elective courses.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there just weren't that many.
Mm-hmm. What do you think brought about the change to have less required classes?
Oh, I think legal education was changing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when Charles Ayers came and particularly brought with him or hired while he, during the first few years he was here, younger faculty that had, went to school at other places that were probably a bit more progressive as far as legal education was concerned than we probably were during the 60s. But legal education all over the country was changing. I mean, clinics were just starting to come in, seminars were starting to be, developed. I mean, the typical model of law school, which is still somewhat that way, but then particularly was very cheap, large classes with the professors, there lecturing or whatever, and so it was just starting to change during the latter 60s everywhere, really.
Mm-hmm. You just mentioned professors lecturing. Was the predominant teaching technique Socratic at the time?
Well, Charles Ayers clearly was, but others were too. I mean, again, I think the better professors were the ones maybe who weren't, were more the old school, probably did a little less Socratic method and more lecturing.
Mm-hmm.
But it was mixed.
Mm-hmm. What was your reading requirement at the time?
Let's see. It was pretty heavy. I remember particularly my first year studying all the time.
Mm-hmm.
We had classes then on Saturday actually, so we had classes 5.5 days a week. Now again, maybe that was just for first year students. I don't remember, because by the time I was in my second year, we didn't have Saturday classes. So I remember studying Friday night, of course, just like it was a regular school night,
Mm-hmm.
and usually maybe taking Saturday afternoon off and Saturday night, but then studying all day Sunday and Sunday night. I spent most of my time in the library my first year till usually late at night. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that was my existence.
Mm-hmm. What were the exams like?
They were kind of like today.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't think much different. Basically, hypothetical problems to analyze. They were hard, I remember, but probably not too much different than a lot of law school exams are today. I mean, we didn't have any multiple choice. I mean, they were all essay type exams.
Okay. And were papers required in some classes?
No, because again, when seminars started coming in my third year, there were papers, but no, I don't remember, other than my third year, ever doing a paper. We didn't have a substantial paper requirement. They were, again, large classes with an exam at the end of the semester.
Were there off-campus events for students? Social events?
There were, again, some of the organizations, particularly like the legal fraternities, would have parties, that kind of thing. But so there were those things that were going on.
Mm-hmm.
But there were no other kinds of events that I can remember. That were centered here at the law school.
Mm-hmm. What was the graduation ceremony like?
It was, I mean, what did I can remember? It was, again, I don't think as personal or, as they are today. There was a graduation speaker, and I think there was a class speaker as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, Yeah.
Typical.
Typical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a couple questions about the faculty at the time that you were in school.
Yeah.
Were your professors accessible for questions?
Yeah. I mean, I think you could go up and talk to them if you needed to. To be very honest, I probably didn't do a lot of that. Again, maybe in my third year, I probably did more of that than I did in my first and second year. A lot of the faculty had, it was sort of a mixed faculty during, my second year and Charles Ayers' second year as dean. A lot of new faculty were hired. Again, they were younger faculty, many of them just out of law school or out of law school only for a short amount of time. Mm-hmm. I think clearly they were more accessible and more student-oriented than many of the older faculty that had been here for many years that, clearly came out of a different era of legal education where there wasn't a lot of interaction between students. They weren't hostile to students, it just wasn't, it was just a more formal situation than I think it was, or it is now. And then in my third year, there were more new faculty hired. So it clearly became, much more student-oriented. There weren't clearly students on committees as there are now. But again, that started to happen, around that time. Mm-hmm. Clearly the dean, at least before Charles Ayers became the dean basically made most of the decisions, including many of the hiring decisions, mm-hmm. Himself. I don't even think faculty had that much input into a lot of things that occurred. But again, I think Charles Ayers changed a lot of that, and the new faculty that he brought in.
Do you know if faculty was required to publish as they are now?
Clearly not like it is today, no. Mm-hmm. Tenure was, I don't think there was a heavy tenure standards. That is, most people, sort of after they're here for a certain number of years got tenure no matter what they did. Mm-hmm. There were clearly some faculty that were publishing, but a lot of faculty was not. Again, the newer people that he brought in, of course, had a more of a scholarly orientation.
Mm-hmm. Who were some of your favorite professors when you were a law student?
Well, Charles Ayers was probably my most favorite in my, he was, in my first year. David Wexler, who again I was a research assistant with, and so he was, he had probably the greatest impact on me and my career and so on. A person named Dan O'Connell, who has now left the law school, who is practicing here in Tucson. Let's see, John Lyons, who was the outgoing dean, very terrific person, who was my contracts professor. Just a real gentle person and a good person. Ray J. Davis, who was torts professor, who was kind of very rough and so on, but it was a good teacher. Mm-hmm. Those are the people I remember the most, I guess.
Mm-hmm. It was the 1960s, obviously, a lot was going on campus.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, clearly the University of Arizona was not the hotbed of political activism during the 1960s, but there were things going on. There were anti-war demonstrations. I remember some pretty, at least under Arizona standards, some pretty large and demonstrations. So there was clearly anti-war activity going on here. And there were some law students, there were some of us who participated. I don't think there were many law students who were the, sort of the leaders of what was going on campus here in that way. But some of us did participate and so on. So there clearly was some activity here. but not like there was in other parts of the country.
Did any faculty participate in the?
Not that I ever knew of. I never saw any at any demonstration that I ever went to, so I don't think any of them, while I was a law student, participated.
Mm-hmm. And did the atmosphere percolate over to the law school?
I don't know, not really, actually. I mean, I didn't feel it so much in law school. I mean, I think if today would be much different of what was going on now on the 60s, I'm sure we'd feel it a lot within the law school. I didn't feel it that much within the law school. Law school was really, divorced from a lot of that was going on. So at least when I was within the law school itself, I didn't feel a lot of that going on.
Mm-hmm. What was the most interesting thing that happened at the law school when you were a student there?
Well, I think just the changes that were going on were probably the most interesting thing. I mean, it was a more traditional law school that, young and new faculty were coming in with new ideas about legal education. So it was exciting in that way. There were clearly changes, and again, I was a student, so I wasn't always integrally involved or even knew of some of the changes I'm sure that were going on. But I think that was exciting. Seeing legal education here changing as far as the one clinical program being started, seminars being started, things like that. So I guess that would be the most exciting, things that were going on.
Mm-hmm. So now we are here in the year 2000.
Right.
What would you say has changed since when you were a law student?
Well, I mean, you wouldn't even recognize the law school today as far as what's going on. I mean, as far as student orientation, as far as the curriculum, I mean, it's like night and day. I mean, I think, we're here to support students, help students. The idea is that when you start law school, you're going to finish law school. That wasn't the orientation then. The kinds of courses that we have are just so much different than the course that we had then. It's just a much different place.
Mm-hmm. What would you say is the defining characteristic of the College of Law now?
That's a defining characteristic of the law school today. Well, because I'm involved in the clinical, I don't know if it's a defining characteristic, but it's surely much more of a part of what we're all about here. I think the idea that students getting involved in the community and that whole orientation. I think there are a lot of defining things. I don't know if there's any one particular thing that defines who we are. I'm sure each faculty member would have a different feeling of what is defining to them. So I guess what's important to me is the fact that is the student orientation of the law school, is the kinds of opportunities we provide law students in the community, in the public interest sector, clinically, and so on.
Mm-hmm. If you had the chance to change one thing, what would you change now to continue that transition towards improving law school?
What would I change? Gosh, I don't know. Pass me on that question.
Okay,
I don't know.
that's fine.
I have to think about that one.
Yes, these are the hard ones. If you could convey a message to future law students who are coming in, say, 10 or 20 years from now, what would it be to give them a history of the place, a sense of what the U of A College of Law is all about?
I think it's a place where one can get a good education and grow And there's a lot of interesting things going on here, and I say, you know, pick out those that are meaningful to you and take part in them. So I guess that's what I would say to people coming into law school.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this last question probably is going to be similar to the one you passed on, so take your time. They kind of probably go together. The last thing I'd like you to think about is what you would like to see the law school accomplish in the future.
Well, in the area that I care about, I'd like to see the clinical programs become stronger. I think we've you know, come a long way in the last few years. I'd like us to continue. I would, you know, I hope particularly the student orientation of the place continues and again becomes stronger. We've hired some really excellent faculty, and I'd like us to continue with that. And you know, there's just a lot of good things going on in lots of areas here, from placement to development to a lot of things, and all of those to continue.
Well, is there anything else you want to add?
Well, I guess if I was going to give a message to third-year students about ready to go out and practice, is don't do harm with your law degree. Do good things. You have a responsibility as a lawyer, and you can do some meaningful things with your life, and so do it, and power to all of you.
Thank you, Andy.